All right, let's now bring in a renowned journalist, filmmaker and author John Pilger to discuss that and other issues here on RT International. John, hello, it's Rory here at Moscow. Rory Sushi, I do hope you can hear me here. Donald Trump doing his first interview with the British press. And one of the issues being raised during that interview was the possibility of U.S. sanctions against Russia potentially being lifted in exchange for some sort of bilateral agreement on the reduction of nuclear arms. How would you read into that potential agreement?
Sorry, Rory, I just don't know what Trump is going to do. So, you know, it seems that all the noises he's made suggest that he wants to do a deal with Russia. That makes a lot of sense from everyone's point of view. There's a great deal of pressure on him not to do that. He seems to be resisting it, but all this is speculation. You know, I'm not a futurist. I don't know what he's going to do after the 20th of June. I would have thought, listening to President Putin's remarks and Trump's remarks, that a deal is in the offing. And that's a very, very good thing. If there's not going to be a war between Russia and the United States. Now, what about China? Mr. Trump seems to divide the world between Russia and China. Good Russia, bad China. So we'll see.
John,
I don't know.
Why do you think the rhetoric has quite swiftly changed? Of course, Russia's been known as the #1 boogeyman as of late. Washington, Trump seems to be toning down that rhetoric, but putting his sights on China. Why is America, why is Trump putting his sights on China at the moment?
No, Rory, I don't wish to be difficult. I've no idea what goes on inside Donald Trump's mind. If I speculate, I suppose I look back on the election campaign when Trump made a lot of rather fatuous use of and abuse of China. He blamed China for destroying jobs in the United States. China became the bogeyman. I think in his coterie, particularly his chief of staff, who is closely aligned with Taiwan, there is a pro-Taiwan element, an anti-Beijing element. Whereas I think Trump himself has always wanted to simply get along with Russia. I mean, you know, you look at his designated Secretary of State. He wants to get along with Russia, but at the same time, he's threatening a war with China. It's utterly bizarre.
Is it possible, John, is it possible, though, that his pick for Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, is saying that to appease some of the war hawks in Washington, potentially?
Yeah, I guess so. I suppose so. I don't know. I suppose so. We're going to have to find out. Isn't it a disgrace that in 2017, we're all held to hostage to what the President of the United States is about to do, when in fact the world is changing. Russia has now reclaimed its independence. China has reclaimed its independence. A whole new hinterland of the world is opening up, and yet we're sitting here worried about what the President of the United States will do, quite rightly, because he has this enormous military power. My own view is the United States, while the United States remains a 19th century power, and that's what it is, basically. It doesn't wear pith helmets, but it is a 19th century, early 20th century power.
It is also a country, though, John, sorry to jump in, with military bases in over 100 countries worldwide at a supposed time of peace in the world.
Well, that's why I call it a 19th century and 20th century country. In the 21st century, you don't do that.
Well, John, I wanted to ask you.
Everyone has worked it out that you don't. Nuclear war is ridiculous. War between great states is pointless. Whether or not you agree with each other, there has to be some kind of peace manage peace between states.
But there certainly
if
are
we
some,
haven't
John,
got
that some, I'm so sorry, but some do say that war is a racket. Your thoughts?
Well, they may say that. War is what? Sorry?
Some of the people there have said in the past that war is a racket. It's big business.
Well, it is a racket. Of course it's a racket. The United States' biggest business is war. Lockheed Martin and all the other major armaments companies have a great hold on the U.S. administration, on the U.S. Congress, the so-called intelligence community and national security monolith, whatever you want to call them, is pointed towards war. Since 9/11, the Pentagon in the United States has been in the ascendancy. Daniel Ellsberg described it as a silent coup.
John, what about the issue of regime change? This is something that Donald Trump has come out saying recently, that America will not focus now on doing regime change around the world. What's your thought on that?
Well, you know, one of the real ambitions of the so-called hawks in Washington, the ultimate ambition was a regime change in Russia. They want to dismember the Russian Federation. Now, if Trump is going to draw back from that, that's very good news. But the United States usually only attacks defenseless countries. It rarely attacks countries that can stand up for itself. That's why this reckless provocation on the western borders of Russia and in the Asia-Pacific against China is slightly unusual. It's taking it up to another level of risk and provocation, because right through its post-World War II history, the United States, which has intervened in something like, I think the Carnegie Foundation said there were 82 major interventions since the Second World War. Something like 2/3 of the United Nations have in some way, members of the UN, have in some form experienced United States intervention in their countries. Now, if that's going to go on, then nothing will change.
Well, John, if I can jump in quickly here, but a few moments ago, you made a mention of the provocation of the NATO war games just on the western borders of Russia, Eastern Europe. Trump saying that NATO is an obsolete organization. And here we have 3,000 American soldiers, nearly 3,000 tanks, a couple thousand Humvees, armored personnel carriers, all being dumped in Eastern Europe. You call it a provocation. Why is NATO having war games again on the doorstep of Russia?
Well, because that's what NATO does. NATO is a war-making machine. It's an American operation. Why is it doing that? Well, I think there is a real strategic extremism in the United States, and there has been since the early days of the George W. Bush administration. In fact, if you go back before that and read some of the literature that was developed during the Wolfowitz time, the invasion of Iraq, and so on, really the prize, as lunatic as it sounds, is Russia. The prize that was almost won during the Yeltsin years, when the United States, ironically, considering the present charges against Russia, intervened in Russia during the Yeltsin years. And what really has been upsetting in the United States is that Russia is again independent. And that's intolerable. That is the measure of, that's why I called it a 19th century imperial policy. The measure of it is the independence of countries. If a country is independent, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, then that's intolerable.
Regardless of what problem. They're a threat to the hegemony, as some might say?
Yes, yes.
John,
Yes, it is.
John, if I can just please bear with me here, because I've got so many questions I really do want to ask you. Of course, we're talking Russia here, Trump as well, his latest interview now in the past 24 hours with the British media, but the hysteria over fake news and alleged Russian hacking, it continues to gain momentum, not just in America, in certain parts of the world right now, with new measures and online filters being introduced to counter the perceived evil. John, we've heard a lot of accusations about Russia fabricating fake news in order to influence the U.S. election. What's your assessment on that? Because the accusations typically come straight from Washington.
We all know it's nonsense. They know it's nonsense. The people asking the questions know it's nonsense. The people who are running the utility in Vermont knew it was nonsense. And it was one of those rare times the Washington Post had to say, we've just published nonsense. Of course it's nonsense. No one with any modicum of intelligence would regard it as anything else.
Well, I mean, John, I'm sorry, just quickly, because you raised such a good point there. It was just the other day that Donald Trump was doing his first U.S. press conference as the U.S. president-elect. It was a bit of a melee, just mayhem, reporters, particularly from CNN, shouting at him. How has it got, John, to the stage where the president-elect is calling CNN, a respected news outlet, a terrible organization and, quote, fake news?
I think the fact that he called CNN a respected news outlet is the most extraordinary thing. I wouldn't regard them as a respected news outlet. Since I've been a journalist during CNN's time, I've never regarded them as respected. I've always regarded most things they've said as extremely doubtful. And as in many respects, a kind of mouthpiece, a direct mouthpiece, the very thing that you people are often accused of being, they are, of Washington. So that's where he got it wrong, that they're a respected outlet. They're not. And he, you know, right across it's the wonderful contradiction, isn't it? In the country which has constitutionally the freest press and media in the world, it has probably today a free journalism that exists only in its honourable exceptions.
Well,
and they're quite
John, as we know, Washington's been making moves now to eliminate and prevent so-called fake news, which is potentially very, very worrying indeed. I wanted to ask you, John, quickly, Barack Obama, he's leaving office in a few days. How do you think he'll be thought of in the future? What is his legacy going to be like? Of course, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize as he was getting warmed up for the White House. What's Obama's legacy?
Well, that was a bit of racism in reverse, wasn't it? It was just ridiculous to give a man a prize for wishful thinking. In fact, Obama in 2009 said he wanted to help rid the world of nuclear weapons. No president since the end of the Cold War has increased nuclear warhead spending as Obama has. Obama has been one of the most violent presidents. He initiated a worldwide terrorist campaign with Hellfire missiles being fired by drones at so-called terrorists, certainly at weddings and funerals and communities in some of the poorest countries in the world. What I find personally some of the most unctuous and almost shameful descriptions are those from so-called intellectuals in the West, writers, journalists, people in the liberal establishment who have had all the privilege that they ought to know better, that they're fawning and sycophancy to this man who has done what he was meant to do. He served the power he was meant to serve.
All the while expressing American exceptionalism as it promotes freedom and democracy around the world. John, one of the first things that Obama did when he got his inauguration was quickly rush to Cairo and make this really moving speech saying that he wants America to have a new relationship with the Muslims of the world in the Middle East. But as you said a few moments ago, he's turned out to be one of the most violent American presidents. He's bombed more Muslim countries than his predecessors.
Well, it might have moved you, Roy. It didn't move me. I thought it was a pretty typical bit of equivocating, of wanting to have it just about every which way. You know, Trump who worries everybody. There's no question about that. As well, they might be worried.
But why does he worry them, John?
Let me finish. But
okay.
They've examined during his president-elect period. You know, when Obama was president-elect in 2008, he authorized, as the coming president, Operation Cast Lead, the attack on Gaza. This was the great liberal, the great humanitarian, the one who, as a group of writers in The Guardian said recently, has this amazing grace. He authorized that attack on Palestinians in Gaza. That's how he began his presidency.
Yeah, you will not be hearing that in any of the Western mainstream media. You mentioned a moment ago, John, that Donald Trump worries the U.S. establishment. Why do you think that is? Some people are asking, will Trump be allowed to be Trump?
I'm not sure what Trump is, but he worries them because they didn't get their woman in place. He worries them because he doesn't come from inside that milieu. Although Trump is actually the embodiment of modern, powerful America. He's made his money on property, but that still puts him outside the State Department, outside the CIA, even outside, to a large degree, outside his own party. And what worries them most of all is that he might recklessly go around the world and make peace with countries like Russia. That would be appalling. How could he possibly do that? We need a second Cold War to keep things cooking along. That may sound parody, but unfortunately, it's true.
John, how does Europe look at the past 8 years of foreign policy in Washington, whether it's the ongoing proxy war in Syria, for example, or other work in the Middle East? How does Europe feel about its number one partner and ally across the pond?
Well, Europe has become a kind of obsequious, hasn't it? I mean, to see the European Parliament in Strasbourg, which once, although it doesn't have a great deal of power, but once came up with some quite good liberal initiatives long ago, to see it trying to bring in this, to copy this anti-propaganda legislation, laying down rules of what is truth and what isn't truth, in order to protect the American, basically the American view of the Western Hemisphere, is really pathetic. I mean, much of Europe has become, in recent years, has turned back on what it promised to become after the Second World War, and that was a certain social democratic beginning of a new Europe, has turned back and become a place of financial extremism, central banks that crush small members like Greece, and in terms of its foreign policy, merely an echo chamber of the United States.
John, I'm so sorry to jump in. I've got 20 seconds left. My final question to you. If you could send one message to the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump for his next years in the White House, what message would you send to the U.S. President-elect?
Leave the rest of the world alone. Leave it alone.
All right, journalist, filmmaker, author John Pilger. Sweet, simple and sweet, short and sweet, and to the point. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and thank you for your insight today.